All right, we are live. Welcome to the Change My View podcast. It is March 10th, 2019. I'm Uncle Hatch, and today we have a guest here. We're going to talk about public schools, fact checking, all kinds of fun stuff, things right online with what Change My View can get into pretty often. So today is user Rack and Stack Mac, but I will let that person introduce themselves. Go for it.
Howdy, happy to be on Rack and Stack Mac. Also Nate in my regular life. Really excited to be on with you here, Michael.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thanks for taking the time here, and got off to about a 15-minute late start. My fault, but thanks for accommodating. I am just going to switch to a headset here. Can you still hear me all right?
Yep, sounds good.
Groovy. Okay, and let me just see if anything else changed because I don't want to. All right, so if you wouldn't mind, could you just read the title of your post and then we'll get into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So title of the post is Change My View. Public schools should be required to teach factual discernment and media literacy as part of a regular curriculum, the same as math, science, social studies, etc.
Great. Okay, and you're coming from Texas, right?
That is right, yes.
Right on. Okay, so I like to ask this of all the OPs that come on. And for anyone listening, this was one of the biggest posts we had the last few months, 4,300 upvotes. So it certainly saw the front page. And so it engendered a lot of discussion, very interesting. And so like a lot of times we'll have someone come in and besides the post, there's a story behind it usually, like what's going on in your life, in your world. And you could have someone on here saying like making grilled cheese sandwich and calling it a melt is like grounds for 10 years in prison. And like, well, what's the problem? Be like, well, I was with my friend and he called it grilled cheese and melt, and it got really heated, and it got really heated.
It's very tenuous issue,
it's like it's still raw, right? So like a lot of times a post is coming from OP's life. It's fairly raw, which in a strange way is counterintuitive. Like they're coming into a post sometimes somewhat passionate about what they're feeling, but because it's like still hot, it's like the steel is still warm. Like I think we get a few more deltas because of that when people come in to put a post on Change My View to say, okay, like once the steel is chilled off and like hardened, like it's actually harder to change people's view, I think. But because OPs come in with some of that passion, it's also a little bit malleability in that fresh window. So I'm just a little curious what was going on with you when you decided you wanted to post this, or was it maybe a long simmering issue, or like what was the context for you personally?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for me, it's something that has, been a reoccurring, issue in my life for years, kind of this thought process. And the post itself is more of a reaction to the question that I've been asking myself since I was in high school of what is the best way to create a well-informed and educated public, not just from a perspective of understanding and disseminating different tangible facts, but also from a critical thinking perspective as well. So this is really the catalyst behind this was that element of would early education as a mandated part of curriculum be the answer to creating that well-informed populace with that goal of being able to just make that ubiquitous across the entire population. And then specifically within this within the context of this post specifically, as it kind of goes in a little bit more detail in the supporting information from a personal perspective, I find that I do have pretty hardened political views, as I think that most people do in America today. But also the fact that having a background in debate and forensics, I've always been interested in really hearing well-articulated perspectives from the other side on whatever issue it is. And I feel that in the climate that we're in now, it's more difficult than it's ever been to be able to have a conversation with somebody that, doesn't see your same perspective on a particular issue. And I think that the largest part of that is the fact that in order to have, in my opinion, a really constructive conversation, a constructive debate that starts from a foundation of agreeing upon the pre-established facts and then forming your opinions from there. So that was really, kind of where that, where the impetus for the post came from.
Okay, so it wasn't really like someone double parked that morning and you were like, let's kill all double parking people. This is sort of a long-standing evolution for you of sort of like, how can we fix this problem?
Well, it started with with a conversation in regards to grilled cheese and melt, but no, yeah, exactly. You're exactly right.
A little bit of a meltdown, I guess. Right on. Sorry, I didn't mean to be so cheesy. All right, so it sounds like you've kind of covered like what's in the text. Is there anything else in the post itself you'd want to mention, or would you like to just read through the actual text of the post? It's kind of your call.
I can read through certain sections of it. I think I covered a good amount. Where I said, the first little bit, catalyst for it started when I was in the debate team in high school many years ago, and from there, the things that I learned in debate are, elements that I never learned in any other, part of being in public school, with, really understanding what a legitimate, source looks like, why it's a legitimate source for research, and then how to be able to, capture both sides of an argument. From there, the only other aspects of the post I wanted to probably read through came from kind of the, in my opinion, something I'd like to talk about if it comes around, is where I believe this whole, major political polarization started, which was with the repeal of the 1949 Fairness Doctrine, which basically shows that, yes, so basically, for those that aren't don't know very much about it, if you think about classic newscasters, broadcasters like Walter Cronkite, these are people that existed during the time of the FCC's 1949 Fairness Doctrine being in place. And basically, what that did is it made broadcasters have to present controversial issues when presenting controversial issues to the public. They had to do it in a way that was honest, equitable, and balanced, giving perspectives to both sides of the arguments. And this is something that began to be repealed and stripped away in the 1980s. And in my opinion, is what has led us, that repeal is what led us to the current political and social climate that we're in today, or at least in large part. So that's kind of the, the primary, I would say, focus of the post. Looking through if there was anything else there. No, I mean, I think that pretty much covers, really what, the foundation of the, the argument was.
Right on. Okay. So for those listening, I can hear them asking already, like, okay, fairness, balance, does that mean we have to give like equal time to anti-vaxxers? Like that kind of question, like flat earthers, equal time, or like equal time? Like how do they balance that out? Just like via the fairness doctrine in lay terms, how do we call it fair, even though it might be something that, one side might have totally wrong, like on the facts, which can happen.
Yeah, so I mean that's a good question, because you're right. It's not all arguments have two legitimate sides. At a certain point, there is there's a difference between truth and fact in that regard. So that is kind of one of the legitimate reasons that led to the downfall of the doctrine as it is. I would say I think it comes down to, if you're going to present both sides need to be reported from a well-researched and well-knowledged angle. So, in your example, talking about anti-vaccination, there are certain people in the community, but at least as far as my understanding is concerned, there really the majority of research that comes on the side of anti-vaccination starts from Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who is a medical professional in the UK that lost his medical license. So it's, just by presenting different perspectives doesn't necessarily mean that both sides are, have the same, that same level. So I do agree with you, and I do think that there's kind of a margin for error there. But it's really just about presenting every element of of a conversation with as much research as could possibly be provided.
Okay, and then then in terms of that fairness doctrine, because it's funny, like it seems like just from another age at this point, like who like how do they do that? How do they make a law about like what a person can say as a newscaster? Like how does that even like what was the enforcement like? It's especially like a audience younger than at least myself. I'm must be a little bit wondering like how would that even work? Like how could they just come in and tell you what you can and can't say if you're Walter Cronkite?
So I think so it's obviously for anyone that works in IT operations or infrastructure, they'll see from my username that my background is in IT. It's not necessarily in in law or in broadcasting, but my understanding of the way that it was enforced was really just with the FCC would impose fines by onto any outlet that superseded the specific guidelines of providing, balance on major issues. Now, I'm not sure if those issues were, pre-decided. If, it's like, okay, well, anytime you discuss vaccination or abortion or whatever, or gay marriage, whatever it is, or if it was just for everything. But my understanding was that it would be called into contention for basically on an appeal process. So if there was if there was an issue with, whatever broadcast station, then that would be, that would be somebody would submit, I guess, a complaint. It would be reviewed, and then if it, didn't provide the balance that was required, then a fine would be imposed. That's my understanding.
Okay.
For those listening, I apologize. Yeah. If it's,
yeah. And I think just the other piece and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm like super rusty on all this, but like because back in the day before cable, even this was all coming over airwaves, and because airwaves are commons, like they're a shared thing that basically the government like allots like X amount of like the AM and FM spectrum or whatever radio waves, and then whatever other waves were used for TVs back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. There's some government control that can happen there because you got to stay within your band. You can't have over 50,000 watts or whatever. And like, so they could say, look, you can use the airwaves, but you can't use these 7 words that are, cuss words or curse words or whatever you want to call it. And also this fairness doctrine was kind of boiled in, I think, a little bit with that whole thing, right?
Yeah, it was definitely in the same tenor.
Or baked in or whatever. Okay, cool. So one thing I would be conspicuous not to just get into a little bit here, because previous listeners to this might have heard me bring this up, but my alternate solution to the education thing is I think we can create like an AI solution to this, like a Watson type credit score for truthiness, where you can go in with AI and like do some things with, how language is used and really get into the nitty gritty of, definitional conflicts and all the, finding like the formats built into each of the major logical fallacies and like really essentially like I don't have time to fact check. Like, so you're saying everyone should know how to fact check. What if, and I'm just gonna throw this at you, like I could just outsource that. Like a while ago, some of my ancestors outsourced like the legitimate use of force to like government, right? I'm like, all right, Thomas Hobbes, like cool. So like we've outsourced that. Like I'm almost ready to just outsource the fact checking. Like I spent too much time fact check. I'm like, I can't do it. I'm busy, right? So like, do you think it could be possible to like legitimately outsource it to competing but independent nonprofit entities that could like credit score agencies do their own fact checking, and then I could just like have my browser set to like only show me news stories at a rating of 800 or above, like until like, I don't know, Vox corrects these 5 facts, they're still going to be in like, a bad credit score, you know what I mean? Cause you gotta like correct your credit record if you owe money to people, right? So same thing. Like, so do you think something like that could be outsourced to like true professionals without like with transparency built into each, kind of like in a Wikipedia style?
Yeah. So I actually that's a perspective I haven't really thought of. So I'm not sure, and this is, not me saying yes or no. I'm just genuinely not sure if AI technology has reached a level yet where that would be something that could be completely automated without a certain, extensive number of auditors also working with the technology.
Oh, there'd be a heavy human element, but yeah.
Okay, of course. Okay, so yeah, so agreed on that. But something I think that's interesting that you may have just changed my view a little bit on here is the idea of having a sliding scale. So it's not just so much of, well, you can trust the New York Times, but you can't trust the Judge Report, where, as opposed to something along those lines, having a sliding scale where it's, there have been, this number of flags for inconsistent facts. So that gives them a rating of, 77%. And then you can set that parameter of I only subscribe to news sources, and academic institutions will only accept news sources with a certain score above a certain percent, because of course there's going to be fallacies, there's going to be misreporting that's corrected. So I think that idea of having it continuously changing actually creates a level of competitiveness among news broadcasters, so that they're actually striving to be more legitimate. Whereas you look at something like BuzzFeed News, which was a complete joke, in my opinion, a few years ago, and has at least made very serious strides over the last few years to try to become a more legitimate news source. So by being able to increase that rating, I think that that's an interesting perspective that would actually do a lot to solve this issue.
Well, cool. All right. Usually people push back a lot on it. It's a pet project of mine that's been boiling in the background for years, and so we'll someday get to actually launching it. But it is called the Triage Project, and lies cost lives. So anyone listening hears about that may hear about it in the future, eventually, maybe after graduation. But I couldn't help but take the opportunity to give it a little bit of a shout out, even though it's my own thing, but because it's definitely relevant to your topic, and I think it's fascinating. Otherwise, I wouldn't be interested in it. So it's part of why I picked your post, because I think because this topic is so important, whatever the case of anyone's solution to it is. And so right now I'm studying, as one of my classes, we're talking about like Vietnam, Korean War, especially Vietnam, things got like really polarized, right? Like, do you feel like versus other points in US history, like we're more or less polarized, or in different ways? Or you just seem to have a lot of research behind some of what you're doing, so I'd be interested to get your historical perspective.
Yeah, so it's interesting. If you look at something like, if you look at something like the Vietnam War, where there's a huge amount of polarization, we could spend the entire podcast talking about why we actually engaged in that arena in the first place. But I think that if you've for anyone that's that's read Noam Chomsky, he talks about in Manufacturing Consent the huge similarities between JFK and Ronald Reagan, in that if you're going to compare something like like a lot of what was going on during the Cold War, and to things that were happening in the 1980s, like the Contra affair in Latin America, I think that one of the reasons that we were successfully able to get we were able to get the United States into the Vietnam War, which is something that who knows if that would be able to happen in an area where there's a lot more or a lot more media transparency. I think that a part of that was an inherent trusting of the government that was lost at that time. And as a result, when we had things like the intervention in Latin American coups, governments, like I brought up the Contra affair, because we had a more educated populace, because we had more critical thinking and more transparency, I think that a lot of those ventures of of international interference and nation building was a lot less successful, and I think in large part due to the fact that the American populace was able to get more involved, was able to understand, so that those the protests, at least in my opinion, were a lot more effective in curbing some of that intervention.
Right on. Okay. So it's kind of like they may have had more polarity, but they had, I guess, better institutional tools to sort of digest that as a civilization at the time, because there was less rapid change in sort of the technology of media, that sort of thing.
I think that was part of it. I think that and this changed the topic entirely, but I think just the fact that we live in a bipartisan country is in my opinion a kind of another issue that's led to this, where I believe that there's very few people educated in politics that genuinely believe 100% of the ideology on the right or 100% on the left. We're all a mix, right? We're all in different degrees. So I think that bipartisan nature, both in relation to that and what we're seeing today, has in large part led to, a national, a pride in your party, and as a result, a general animosity towards the other, not necessarily based on the politics, but based on an me versus you, where as opposed to we have agreeing ideas on this, dissenting ideas on this, and as a result, it's very one or the other. If that makes sense at all, I think it's kind of a combination of the two.
Yeah, well, it's I took a great class last semester at UCLA. John Zaller was professor, and he did a whole part of the course on how polarization, like the data behind a lot of it, and you can just see these like charts of like basically you see like these two XY, they're like the scatter plots, and you see like in earlier Congresses, like the dots are like they tend towards left or right, but there's a lot of overlap. And then you just see over time as like the dots go more and more away from each other into their like almost completely own constellations. And it's like really terrifying. But there's like a deeper thing also where like there's not just like a change in just the political opinions, which is just that surface level, but like also more and more people who are saying the other side is not like people who disagree, but they are the enemy kind of idea. And so it's like on this deeper like elemental strata, it is getting even worse. So I've heard the argument made, I forget by who, that there's an analogy with social media to the printing press, where after the printing press, there was a huge like paroxysm across the European continent between, essentially it allowed for Protestantism to pop up. And then you had like 100 years of war and like, just like unimaginable levels of like death and dying as a percentage of population. Like we couldn't imagine today. So like it took 100 years to like sort that out. And it was a mess, right? Like the fallout from the printing press was also like it was cool afterwards. You had like this like more formal university and college system, and like this sort of like professors could, like a lot of that was kind of outsourced in a bit. So we haven't like had a civilizational collapse yet with there's a dripping yet there with social media. I think we can get over the hump, but like, what's your feeling like optimism wise? Like, is there, like, does it just keep getting more polar with each social media bubble on both sides? Do you think just better education can kind of bring more to the middle and more understanding at least?
So I think that's exactly what it is. That last point, and that's really coming full circle. The catalyst behind this is because, once you've reached a certain age, once you're established in a certain community, people don't want their view changed. It's one of the reasons that that changed my view is probably my favorite subreddit. On the Reddit community, because it's educated people coming to a forum with the express purpose of wanting someone to change the way that they fundamentally look at something that they hold to be true and right. And the aspect of having your view changed, thinking critically, it starts with genuinely wanting to broaden your perspective. And I believe that once you're already in those established thought presses, in your established ideologues, you no longer have a desire, at least most people don't any longer have a desire to have those views changed. So that's why I say, not to be so cynical, but the current and the past generations, that are already living, we're lost in the aspect of most people don't want that to change. So by starting it at the academic level early on in public schools, that's about training the next generation to be able to think more critically and think more open-mindedly, so that social media can take on a more inclusive and a more collaborative place in our social circles, as opposed to the polarizing nature that it keeps on pushing us into further divisiveness today.
Yeah. And there's like, the more you're not sharing the same factual bedrock, right? Like the more that someone else's opinion that's different from yours is not just like different, but it's like, how could they possibly do X and Y if C is correct? They must be doubly like diabolical to both. But like, it's like baked into the other side's argument. Like there's two versions of the abortion argument that are both sides misrepresent the other side. Like, and one side's like, the other side wants to kill babies, right? And the other side's like, well, we're not about killing babies. Like we like have like complicated like issues of like the autonomy and like bodily integrity and like what counts as a human and brain development and like all right. And then like you could switch that and the other side's like, well, the other side just wants to control women. And they're like, well, we're not trying to control women. Like we believe the soul comes in at conception and like we're just trying to work this out too. Like, so like, but if you're, let's say, a pro-life person and you're like, how could someone who's pro-choice want to kill babies? They know they're babies, their life, right? Like, wait, you're smuggling in your own answer with your own premise. So getting to the same strata, the strata is almost deeply baked into the opinion itself. Like, how do you like you send the kid home with these new critical thinking skills to the home where the political bubble of either side exists? Like, how does that learning survive in a house where suddenly it's coming against a household culture that might be against elements of it?
Exactly. So, I mean, obviously you've chosen the most difficult topic, that there is to change someone's view on, right? Because, and I think the fundamental reason for that is because of exactly what you just said. Is one side, it's where you decide to call, a human life a human life. And at a certain point, once you boil it down past all of the science, all of the biology, at a certain point, it is an opinion. There's no more fact to be decided. This is a child, this is a fetus, this is a life, this isn't. Which is why it's one of those things, you learn never to debate that issue, because people have their opinion, those are set, right? But I think that this is more about, in my perspective, something along the lines of, if you were to say, for instance, we don't need a border wall along the southern border of the United States. One of the reasons for that is because we had a mass exodus out of the United States of illegal immigrants during Obama's presidency. There have been actually the largest decrease in the amount of people illegal immigrants coming across the border during those 8 years than there were before. Why do we need to increase security? Well, if I'm talking to somebody on the other side and they say, no, that's incorrect, we had more illegal immigration than we ever had in America in the last 8 years. At that point, we're not discussing whether or not immigration is good, whether or not we should be inviting illegal migrants or refugees into the country. We're debating whether or not it's true how many immigrants came into America. And if I show you an article that says it's less and you show me an article that says it's more, how are we ever going to find a point of commonality in our arguments if we can't even start on those base facts?
Yeah, it's the facts are floating in like these narrative clouds, and like it's not clouds isn't the right metaphor, but like they're just like, it's like one of these trees that grows around an old fence post over 100 years. Like the fence post is in the tree now. It's like it's like the facts, like to accept certain facts threatens the whole like superstructure, or it's super dicey. It's I tend to like find myself more and more just like restating the best version of both sides that I can find without taking an opinion. Like, because it's like my agenda now. I feel like my agenda is this like conversation. It's just like your post is about is, and I hope there's more. And that's what I'd love to hear from any other one else who's listening. Like, has anyone else found that your agenda is less about issues and more about like how do we fix this? Because I do hear more people talking about that. I don't know. I'm sorry. I didn't really have a question there, but I just wanted to. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm not sure about
do you find that more people are interested in solving the meta question or the conversation that you brought up? But your post was about a meta answer to this bigger problem, polarity.
I think that it's interesting. The reason that I loved the responses that I did award deltas to were because it wasn't so much we shouldn't be teaching digital literacy or we're already teaching it well enough, which is, one of the more upvoted comments, which I didn't award a delta to because I don't think it's being taught well enough. The fact that we learn primary and secondary sources in social studies in 8th grade, I don't think that actually teaches anybody true factual discernment. Mm-hmm. The things that I gave deltas to, which I felt really garnered more productive conversation, were different aspects of it. Is, okay, well, we all agree on accomplishing this goal of, creating a more critically thinking, more well-informed populace. What is the best course of action in order to accomplish that goal? And whether or not teaching it in this structure in primary or secondary schools is the answer to that. And the deltas that I awarded were kind of those that were able to kind of veer my perspective along implementation rather than being along the lines of, well, is the goal of this good or bad, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up that reply. That was the top response from user GSCJJ. Would you mind if I read that back real quick, just
of course,
for those listening that haven't seen the post? So this was the top voted post, 823 upvotes, and here it is. This is the top reply to your post. They say, it's already taught in school. In English, students are usually taught the difference is between a primary and secondary sources. They are taught to cite sources. They are also taught how to differentiate and categorize their sources, or at least I was when I was in school. We were also taught ethos, biases, etc. I'm guessing that's supposed to be ethics, or anyways, we'll keep going. In science, students are taught to create a hypothesis, how they came to that conclusion, and proving it as fact or fiction. In math, everything needs a proof. Steps you took come to a conclusion, and why a certain assumption is always true, and when it is true under certain circumstances. And finally, we are taught how to discern fact from fiction. But it's hard to teach people to not seek a truth they are looking for solely to affirm their beliefs, especially political or religious beliefs. So there you go. Yeah.
So my thoughts on that is, did you go to an American public school when you were growing up?
Yes, I went in Riverside and Marina Valley, Riverside County, outside of LA. Yeah, just standard public school.
Did you take a foreign? Gotcha. Did you take a foreign language when you were in school?
Yeah, Spanish. 3 years, and I can.
Do you speak Spanish fluently today?
Not at all. Nope.
Exactly. So I think that's exactly it. I learned Spanish in school. And I live in Texas, and I speak an embarrassingly small amount of Spanish.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that the issue is it's not. So I think that they address it's like, okay, yes, we do learn those things, or I'm sorry, we are taught those things, but it doesn't appear based on the evidence of the world that we live in today that we're actually learning them. And I think that that's the difference. Is just reading the textbook, having those lessons, I don't think is getting us all the way there. Which is why I believe, that there needs to be a fundamental restructuring in the way that we look at education, in the way that we look at how we're teaching these issues.
Gotcha. You did award a Delta, though, right? I'd love to talk about that.
3 Deltas.
Oh, 3. That's right. Apologies. And do you have any of those handy, or do you want to talk about any of them in particular?
I do. I would say that the Delta that I awarded, that I was most impressed with the response that really that really kind of changed my view the most, came from CPT Beetle, Captain Beetle, I imagine. It's actually not one of the most upvoted responses, but I didn't know if you'd wanted to read through that, or if you have that.
It's just loading, and it got frozen for a second here, but yeah, see, because I have the Delta log here, and I had the other ones came right up, but for some reason his was listed differently. Let me just Control F for him.
Certainly.
While we're a little dead air here,
because they're all 3 of them are very different perspectives and change my views in different ways. If you wanted to start with the different,
I've got the other 2 ready here, so I'll just jump into that.
Yeah.
And this is it's a little bit of a back and forth here, but this was not a robot probably, which is the username, not a robot probably. And they start by quoting a higher up quote, but we'll just quote that and keep going. That higher up quote is, vaccines do not cause autism. Human activity is impacting global climate. Our drinking water is not turning the frogs gay. Okay, so that's the quote. And then their reply continues. With examples like this, I don't think a media literacy approach is the issue. This kind of stuff is addressed by even a basic understanding of how science works, by which I mean the system/scientific method, evidence-based conclusions, etc. If our education and science-based critical thinking isn't working to address these things, why do you think a class on good media sources would work? Moving past that and assuming that we can get on to more nuanced topics, I have a hard time seeing how this could work as a class without either the opinions of the individual instructors or government regulation unduly influencing which media outlets are considered quote unquote trustworthy. Lastly, the way in which news media is delivered and consumed changes over time. And I think it's safe to say we're still very much in the middle of a large shift in that regard. Therefore, I think a better strategy would be to focus on general critical thinking and evaluation of information rather than focusing on media literacy towards the way things are today. If you still believe that additional classes are needed rather than just focusing on more effective education in existing subjects, I think a more beneficial approach would be to have a class on generalized critical thinking and logical argument. Period. That's the end of Not a Robot Probably's post. Reply to you. Yeah.
Yeah. So we had one more back and forth before I awarded the delta from there.
And we can go through that if you want. It's up to you.
We can just kind of, we don't have to read through all of it if you don't feel it necessary, but just kind of the highlight of my response to that was basically just in let's see, it was okay, so we can kind of skip through that. So basically the area that the comments specifically that I awarded the delta for was really the argument that it was, the ability to distinguish legitimacy in reporting is nothing without a foundational understanding of the philosophy that dictates the truth or lies that reporting espouses. So this was kind of an interesting area where the idea of critical thinking became a lot more important, to my view in regards to that comment, just because it was kind of what we highlighted a little bit earlier is, well, if we're learning it, if we're just given those facts, if kids have to watch a video in their English class about, what fake news is and, why social media sometimes can't be trusted, is it necessarily going to actually create long-lasting impacts on the way that those students view the media, view social media, right? So I guess the idea of implementing this kind of lesson into a mandatory psychology class was something that I felt that I could get behind, because I believe that the discernment of fact and fiction is inherently tied into necessary critical thinking skills, and one without the other does not accomplish the task that we're looking to do so of, as we discussed before, creating a truly well-informed and educated and active populace.
Groovy. I did see one thing in here I did want to quote out of their other reply that led up to your delta. And this popped out to me, but it just said, as for the fairness doctrine, I have no objection to the goal of such a legislation. I do worry about the real world effectiveness and potential abuses of the system. Would you trust Ajit Pai to implement such a law fairly? So I just thought that was worth quoting just because it's cool. Yeah, I think you covered sort of your thinking on that one pretty straightforward. I was going to jump to the next one unless you had anything else on it.
So I guess maybe a question for you. I know it's not necessarily a debate, but the fact that you bring up Ajit Pai and the actual, because the FCC.
Well, that was the other comment, but yeah.
No, exactly. Yes, but the FCC, as it's I see what you're referring to, is it should be ideally just like the Supreme Court, a non-politically affiliated organization, which is bringing up Ajit Pai, something that is incredibly contentious of the FCC getting more involved with politics. So do you believe that that having something like the Fairness, in Reporting Act would negatively impact one political party or one demographic more than another, and help one demographic or one political party more than the other?
I think both parties have some fact-based problems. So I think right now, in terms of like brand-wise, which party feels like it's more pro-science, that's definitely Democrat Party, but that hasn't always been historically true, and I'd like to see it more balanced. Ultimately, I think the Republican Party's got a lot of big rebuilding of itself coming, and it's and if it doesn't adopt a more science-based, it's going to be in real trouble in the future, just in terms of the demographic changes, where so if you look at one of the biggest problems with the wage gap is an education gap, and for people to jump that gap, it's becoming harder to get education because the cost of education is going up. So like that's like an underlying. So it's like getting pro education is the only way I can see to like shrink that wage gap, which is becoming a problem like globally. It's even, I mean, and everywhere in the world that was like doing these huge developmental jumps in the last few decades are like already seeing that same issue as well. And that, so the Republican Party is not in a good place with that big emergent issue. And so I think at the moment, the Republicans have a bit of a bigger problem with that, but I don't think that's necessarily unmovable. I don't think that's, but with the global warming thing, it's, I mean, and again, I'm just one person here, but it seems like they've picked the wrong side of that fight in terms of a long-term strategy. I just don't see how you end up winning that one. But yeah, so long and imprecise answer to your question, but that's the rough of it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess kind of there wasn't a right or a wrong answer. I was just kind of curious on your perspective of that, because
no, that was the right answer. I think
that, yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. I think the foundation of it is, and I think that the way that the conversation, and if you look through a lot of the less upvoted comments, it got very, very politically charged very, very fast. And I really did try to make an effort in the initial post to avoid that as much as I could, because coming full circle on it, the goal is not to say one party's right, one party's wrong, one's on the right or wrong side of history. The goal is that we should not be supporting political parties. We should be supporting lawmakers that stand for the things that are going to be best for us as individuals and best for us as a population. And by lumping those into one area or the other, then a lot of times that can be lost in the kind of convolution of that discussion. So that's kind of why it's not, I think it was important. Something that I wish I'd done a better job clearing up is, this isn't an attack on one party or an attack or a bolstering of the other. It's more of a fact of, like you'd said, there are faults on both sides, but the idea is that we create in an environment where political parties don't need to be so strong, because people are well informed enough to be able to choose their own lawmakers, their own legislators based on these kinds of facts and these kinds of issues.
Excellent. Okay. You did mention one thing on that one before too, as well as the difference, and you'd mentioned it earlier, so I think it's twice it came up, but this idea of a difference between truth and fact. And for those listening, wondering, many listening might be thinking, oh, it's the same thing. Like, what was the distinguishing thing in terms of your choice of the words truth versus fact?
So I don't want to take credit where I don't deserve it. That exact quote initially came from a different comment that I really liked that phrasing. And at least in my perspective, not to try to extrapolate from somebody else's view based on just a post. I would say that truth is the thing that I'll say fact is an inalienable data point, right? It is
an observation.
Global warming exactly. Yeah, global warming is increasing. The global temperature of Earth by this %. It's a fact, whatever it is, right? A truth is something more along the lines of your abortion argument of a fetus is a human life, an infant is a human life. You hold those things to be true, but because they cannot be factually disseminated, because they are subjectively inherent, they're inherently subjective, then it's a truth, but it's not necessarily a fact.
So the previous exposure I had to the same question too, and these are some of just a couple of other perspectives I've stumbled across on it, was many years ago. I took a screenwriting course from a guy named Robert McKee, and he was talking about being a writer. What he tells writers in the end of the day is like, write the truth, but he's got a capital T in there. And like, the idea is that it's how you think the world works. Like, if you're writing for Disney and you think everything comes with a happy ending, like, that's your truth. Like, that's the worldview you're espousing. And you might be like more of like an auteur type of author doing a director, let's say, like, you want to do a movie about the world doesn't make sense at all, and it all comes back in a circle in the end or something. And it's just like they were billiard balls or ping pong balls that had no will, but we're just going to watch them bounce around in this like their conception of the universe is not one of meaning, but one of like randomness or, you know, so there's like these different views of how you think the world works. So like he would call truth, that capital T truth, like your idea of how the world works, or how, and alternatively, there was a beautiful, horrible, depending on your point of view, 2 hour debate between two fairly smart guys, Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, many years ago, 2 years ago, I think, something like that, where they couldn't get past the first, like, and I know them to be like, you know, they're two people who I was like interested to hear talk to each other, and I love that they actually ended up disagreeing because they couldn't get past the truth versus fact thing. And I ended up like diagramming out every definition of like truth and fact and like lining them up and highlighting like what, and it's like, there's so many different, I don't, to me, it seems like it's like a way of fighting over like a zero sum game of the lexicon. It's like, you think there's like not you, but like it can generally be contentious because they're like, well, truth means this or fact means this. Like, it's not like you can go to the dictionary and notice, oh, there's 27 definitions of the word of, you know, fact, right?
Yeah.
But then you might get a paper assignment from a professor that says, you know, what is truth? And then like write about it. But like, oh, well, you didn't specify. There's like 23 definitions. Just point the one you want me to use, right? But instead, it's like opened up to like breathe and to just like turns into a mirror more of than a study exercise. And I don't know, sorry, there wasn't really a formal question there for you or anything, but just while we were on it, that seems to be at least what I've seen out there. Yeah.
But that's interesting. Here's, you know, two of the most, intelligent, intelligent minds, and, going into this discussion. And even if they have different perspectives, this really does kind of come, truly, enveloped in, what we've been discussing this entire time of, they both agreed that they were not able to continue the discussion, even if it was just, because of the disagreement on the initial fact of what they were discussing. In this case, it was over something that may have been arbitrary, like the lexicon of this word, right? But the idea of, if we're going to have a truly, comprehensive and an honest discussion with one another, then we need to start from a place of mutual understanding, mutual respect, and mutual agreements as to what the facts are, what the truths are going into this conversation.
And just for fun there, I found that list of the, well, if you're listening, it won't give you any help, but just for fun, that was sort of, there's more pages of this, but it gives you an idea of like just how hairy just a bare listing of usages can get with truth versus fact, no less the deeper philosophy. So anyway, so I'm thinking we could jump into your next deal, if that's cool.
Of course.
All right, cool. So let me just, I did a window shuffle there, and now I think I lost that window. Oh no. Okay. So my tab game has been pretty bad this episode. Sorry. Oh, here it is. I put over the other one. Okay. So the next one up is, no. Oh, crap. Okay. Hold on. Okay, we did this. And okay, so we don't have Captain. We'll save Captain Beetle for last. But now I'm looking at the post by username ECILSEMOH, Esilsemo. The best I've got. Oh wait, it's home slice backwards. Nice. Okay.
Love that. Didn't get you.
I was like, what are they doing there? Okay, so I just was listening to myself say it. I'm like, I sound like a record backwards. And okay, so I will read what they wrote to you, and then you can decide if you want to read your own or talk a new one back. But I'll start with home slices. Okay, so they say, it seems that what you want is instruction covering how we absorb information, dissecting what we believe to be true, evaluating those beliefs against available information, and having mental flexibility to adjust beliefs if errors are discovered. You are asking for the wrong class. You want philosophy.
Yeah, so we touched on this a little bit, but this is basically where I then kind of posed the question, or kind of challenged to this response of, I believe that as a subset of philosophy, my view could possibly be realized, but I'm curious about how you would see that implemented. So it was this kind of next response that gave me that allowed me to give them a delta here following that. If you wanted to go into that next comment.
Okay, and then he has a longer one, and then so your delta comes after his longer response. So
yes,
I'm just going to charge through it. It's a bit long, but I'll try and go fast. Okay, so in fact, because yours was short, would you mind just reading it just in your own voice, just so we have it for anyone who hasn't read it?
First response or where I
yours? Yeah, you were kind of summarizing it just now, but just so we have it.
Okay, yeah. So
cool.
In response to what you just said, or the first comment I said, interesting take. Thank you.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is the closest I've been to awarding a delta. But at least where or when I was in school, philosophy was not a part of standard curriculum. If you would be willing to elaborate, I believe that as a subset of philosophy, my view could be possibly realized, but I'm curious as to how you would see that implemented.
Great. Okay. And so Home Slice Backwards says, the largest issue, in my opinion, with directly teaching technique to determine media reliability is it would be likely be biased off of certain centrist guide points like NPR, AP, Reuters, BBC, etc. that absolutely are rife with editorial bias at minimum. Everyone is lying to you for their own ends, and even those who are calling out the lies are often doing the same, albeit unwittingly. Fake news is bad. I would say that real news that hides the truth is even worse. Philosophy is the search for truth, not necessarily fact. The ability to obfuscate truth with fact is something we deal with all the time, be it the racist talking head recruiting FBI crime stats or the U.S. government and nearly every Western news agency, providing rationale to lead the West in supporting the Venezuelan coup. Awareness of agenda is worthless when you are unable to discern which facts might have been colored by ideology without awareness of what motivations the sources might have. People access facts and belief through family, community, government, and media. Gaining the critical thinking skills and skepticism that the study of philosophy brings seems to me the only path to elevate oneself from ideology in order to see potential truth. All right, we're 3/5 of the way through here. Philosophy is the search for truth. Philosophy is also the study of how we think. It is not only time-consuming, but entirely undermines every other topic we learn in school that is not a hard science, though it often does so here as well. I see no way this question could be included in any public schooling, as it requires a government that has a want for a critical populace, which will question every action made on its behalf, a population without patriotic dogma. Last paragraph. The only view I have to change is that such a class you propose, without it being a short departure from the larger study of philosophy, it would have no result other than producing a more centrist, subservient, and ideologically aligned population. The best you could do here is to eliminate fringe stories, but we have seen that there is where truth. There is where truth sometimes hides. There we go. E.g., the decades of COUNTINTELPRO, all caps, it's like an acronym type of thing, stories. There's arguably no objective truth, but philosophy can at least allow us the possibility to see there's likely bullshit. And that's the end of this quote there from Home Slice spelled backwards.
So a few interesting takeaways from this. So where I gave the delta on this was actually very much in line with what you and I just kind of discussed prior to this. What I had written was the ability to distinguish legitimacy in reporting is nothing without a foundational understanding of the philosophy that dictates the truth or lies that reporting espouses. Philosophy is the search for truth, not necessarily fact. And I said that was an incredibly enlightening perspective. Thank you for your articulate, balanced, and thought-provoking comment, Delta. So so I gave that Delta basically because of that same area of the foundational importance of critical thinking prior to an understanding of, or prior to the ability to, have truly factual, discernment. But what I think is really interesting about this particular post is his reference to COINTELPRO. For those that are not familiar, basically, my understanding was it was a counterintelligence program put on by the United States government somewhere between the mid 1950s, right into the I think it was the beginning of 1970s, 1971, basically with the goal of exposing communists and subversive operatives in the United population, similar to some of the surveillance on a much more wide scale that we're seeing today. So basically the idea of we had fringe stories that were reporting even back then that the government was surveilling people illegally. Nobody believed them because they were coming from these, very radical publications. So we need to protect those publications. Otherwise, we're going to have a detrimentally centrist population. So that's kind of an area where it went a little bit further than I'm comfortable saying I agree with. I think that, frankly, yes, you want different perspectives, but the idea of having a centrist population is not really a dystopian. I think the idea of being more balanced is something that we should probably strive for, even if it's not necessarily centrist. This aspect is, and the reason I bring that up is because things like that where you have less popular, more fringe reporting, that's where, if I might give you another endorsement here, something like your sliding scale of legitimacy, the way that you describe how we could leverage artificial intelligence, machine learning in order to do some of the auditing and fact checking for us could be really beneficial, because I know personally, if I'm going to see an article come across my feed on social media from a source that I don't recognize at all, I'm less likely to trust that. So by having it with that, having things like that where they are exposing things that are important, even if they're not widely publicized, I think that, being able to allow for those kinds of broadcast publications to exist, but also creating a necessary thumbnail on all of those things to show how historically accurate those publications have been would be a way that we'd be able to address both of those issues.
No. All right. Well, I'll take a shout. That's but it's like, it's never been easy. Like, you could go back to, the invention of agriculture, or like medieval times with the printing press, or like, I just feel like this thing of the two sides like coalescing, right? Like Jonathan Haidt has a great book called The Righteous Mind, talking about, why is this that we have these two parties that seem to sort of like be getting tribal and forming these bubbles, and the phenomenon of conservative versus like progressive or liberal seems to be emergent like in democracies pretty much anywhere, like whether or not it's parliamentary system or two-party system, right? Like you still have this gradient of left and right. Like, is that a feature of like the success of humanity, that we have these two polarities that sort of ebb and flow in their power? Like, would we have seen these same sort of sine waves, sort of ups and downs in ancient farm villages or like tribes, right? Like, and so I like, is that ability, like you're saying, like okay, moderate is good, but also like some movement that adapts with time, like left and right, like sort of self-correcting in a way.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So that's, I think that kind of takes the next degree, which is a bit of a wink to a previous really engaging Change My View podcast from a few months ago, talking about, trying to remember the actual title of it, but it was discussing the looking through history through a modern lens, and if we should, and if legacies of former, of formerly, famous people for doing amazing things, if their legacy should be altered, if they should be, judged from a modern context. And the example being, and I'm sorry to whoever the OP was on that for absolutely butchering your post, but the basically, the aspect of, was the fact that Thomas Jefferson, was the fact that Thomas Jefferson, being a founding father, being, one of the fathers of American agriculture, one of the fathers of American democracy, was the fact that he was a slaveholder. Does that diminish his legacy? Should we look at him through a different lens today than, the population might have then? And I think that that's kind of part of it, where, his legacy may have been reported differently then than it would be now. And I think that that's where this kind of comes from, is by creating an environment where we understand not truth, but fact. And that, these are the facts of, Thomas Jefferson, he did all of these things and he was a slaveholder. Then we can start from that base layer and then decide from that point how we want to gauge his legacy today, how we did it 200 years ago, how we're going to do it 100 years from now, the idea behind this post and how it kind of connects to that is, if we are writing our narratives, if we're writing, you know, if we're understanding, if our media is kind of putting out rhetoric today that clouds and convolutes the way that we understand the facts, then we're never going to be able to form our own honest and genuine truths in the way that we view any issue or any legacy notwithstanding.
All right, I'll let that stand just as it does, right there. But actually, there was one thing about that episode that it struck me, and it sort of stuck with me as a little bit, is at some point the trope of the historical, anytime that sort of discussion comes up, there's a point made that, well, that was the standard of the time. You know, do we judge Julius Caesar for having, you know, a personal aide who was his slave, but also probably had a better life than, you know, most average Roman citizens, let's say, or something, right? Like, is that, and so I think in that discussion we're talking about the, you know, the slavery in the South before the Civil War, and like, what occurs to me is when we say that was accepted at the time, what are we doing to the people of that time if we don't give the slaves a vote in our historical, like, imaginary Congress of what was accepted? Like, we're just like enslaving them again by like saying, oh, that was accepted at the time. Like, no, it wasn't. It wasn't accepted by the slaves at the time. They were enslaved. Like where's their vote in my like history Congress of an out? Like if we're gonna say, was it acceptable to be a peasant in medieval Europe? They'd probably be like, no, this sucks. But we're like, right? But we're only asking like the kings and queens and princes about whether that's okay, and they're like occasional, you know, Machiavelli type assistants that end up being famous authors that were red letter. But right, like why are we leaving out the vote of, you know, all those who are on the worst end of the stick in all of these various historical situations when we say, oh, that was just the way it was back then, that's what was accepted? Like, I don't think it was. But sorry about the tangent, but pet peeve. So I am furiously scrolling trying to find this Beetle post, and it is
I can pull it.
I feel like Will Smith here trying to find this beetle. I think that was a cockroach, actually, but okay. But I see it because I found that control heft for him, and I found two. I just didn't see one with your delta. There's a longer post. Aha, there it is. I got it. And I'm going to give you the link too, if you need it.
I got it pulled up here.
Okay, cool. So I will begin by reading Captain Beetle's comment, unless there's one above it you think I should reference first.
No, that's perfect.
Cool. So this is the one you thought was the most interesting. So we'll kind of go through this and talk a little bit about that, and then see if we have any wrap-up thoughts, but I think we are actually going pretty long. So here goes on Captain Beetle's post. He says, "Hi there. I can't see you are wrong. I will just call it all, quote unquote, critical thinking. I believe that the government of the USA, both major parties, is disincentivized to actually educate people in this fashion. Being aware of the facts instead of buying the spin will work directly against people believing that either major party is actually legislating in their genuine interest or on the platform on which they ran. I legitimately believe I believe in lobbying to add critical thinking / source discernment is completely pointless, since neither party would ever roll it out in such a way that people were being educated to discern political facts. I think you need to work instead on total political reform. In particular, 100% remove financial, legislative incentives, political donations, paid lobbyists, etc. I think with a political system that truly represented your collective good, then you would get these changes organically. People would be voting and politicians legislating on empirical data / fact-based ideology." All right, halfway through. I guess my point is that there's loads of things wrong with quote unquote the system, the quote unquote system rather. But if these things negatively impact the status quo, then we can't expect change. That would be political suicide. We can't expect change. That would be political suicide. So instead, we need to change what political suicide looks like. Money and corruption in politics is so entrenched that you probably need a full-blown revolution, not a voice calling for critical thinking to be brought into the schools. Of interest, though, it's lovely thought that with fact-based policy, people wouldn't need to argue about things like drug policy, climate change, etc. Simply agree drugs are a big problem. Let's review the data and implement the strategy with the greatest efficacy. Instead, people could argue issue priority and just be confident that either party will adopt best practice policy, because not doing so would be political suicide. So you said Delta 3 times there. You're like Delta, 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 which reminds me of old SNL. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So I love this, and I broke that down into 2 points, and then I want to make one other reference to something else that he said there, and then we can kind of wrap up. So the response: Delta, Delta, Delta. Hot damn, Captain Beetle, you just hit the nail on the head for me. Said I awarded you a Delta for 2 reasons. One, I actually appreciated you reframing the context of the argument from a more pragmatic perspective. It doesn't matter if we should change the curriculum if the curriculum cannot in reality be changed in the manner you suggest. This is incredibly poignant and the primary reason I'm awarding the Delta, but I also just so happen to agree with you with your view on a deeper level because of ... to my own personal bias and opinion. I made it clear that this is not the primary reason I'm awarding the Delta, but I happen to also personally hold the view that the most important issue by far in the American political system is campaign finance reform. To me, the foundation of American democracy is an electorate representative of the people, whether they are Republican, Democrat, Whig, or anything else, and not of special interests. And I said, okay, I'm off my soapbox now. Thank you for your reply, kind strangers. So basically, the reason that this did it for me is it again kind of breaks down to, it's not an argument of what we're trying to do and if we should do it or not, but on if this is going to most effectively accomplish the goal of creating a more well-informed and critical thinking population. And I think that this kind of comes down to the answer of it wouldn't make a difference, because if you look at the foundation of why we're in the place that we're in now, the FCC chairman that actually brought down the fairness in reporting doctrine, which was, I believe, Mark S. Fowler, was basically, quoted as saying, it's, the perception of broadcasters as community trustees should be replaced by a view of broadcasters as marketplace participants, i.e., they continue to say a television is just a toaster with pictures. This is a direct quote, and that was kind of the foundation of why is, total deregulation in all regards, and that it doesn't make a difference whether or not we're talking about soybeans or whether we're talking about the broadcast media. And it may come as a shock to nobody that this FCC chairman was appointed by Ronald Reagan. But basically what this comes down to, and the reason that I was so, fervently awarded these Deltas, was because my view has been changed in the aspect of, I do believe that media literacy should be taught in some aspect in our public education system. Where I added to that, in regards to this comment, is that media literacy can only be effective when also tied in with a government that's actually representative of their constituency. And that is how we both create a well-informed public and we create a political system that allows for a government that actually bolsters the majority of its population.
So if I were to try and so my takeaway on that, just to make sure I'm properly understanding sort of the exchange that happened between you two, is essentially that he's saying you may want this change to happen, but given the current constraints of the political system, there would be a lack of incentive to implement that kind of education because it would undermine the power structures that put those people in place. Essentially.
Exactly.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay, cool.
For instance, exactly.
I had a very strange experience with a book last semester. And the book was called Act of Congress. And it was essentially designed as a case study of just generally how a law becomes a law, but like including all the ugliness of how the sausage is made. And so, I forget his name, but a very experienced Washington Post reporter was given essentially full behind the scenes access under Dodd-Frank, mostly by Frank, but Dodd cooperated like a ton also and this is the bill of 2008 after the financial crash. Like, what are we going to do? What's the new bill? Mm-hmm. And so you start like following all the like the backroom deals, and he's like just tracking all of these deals and like how they went and all the like the stunts that one congressman would pull on another one to like just completely undermine him. Like he'd agree to all these deals and then like suddenly do this press conference out of nowhere saying, I'm totally not up with this deal, and like pull out at the last second. And it's all this political maneuvering. And like you just hear like story after story. It's like watching like World War II and the Eastern Front, like, or reading about or doing Dan Carlin on it. And after a while, you're like, it's just horrible after horrible after horrible, right? But like in a weird way, as we got through the book, you start to like see how like there's this one group wanted 50% off of this and they only got 20% off, and this other group on the other side wanted more here, but then they only got half of what they want. And then like in this strange way, like a Monet painting, as you walk away from it, you're like kind of like, oh, so it's kind of like it's all being negotiated and is working, kind of, but like not in a great way. But then at the end of the day, like all of the influencing parties that were organized, like that wanted him to influence, like kind of did get their piece of the pie. And like it's weird. It's kind of like it's working. It's like all these horrible ways it's going, but then like the aggregate balance is sort of like it is still sort of working as a system. And we did kind of get a bill that mostly worked. And it was like, and I was just like, I just wanted to throw out an alternate perspective just from that class. It was the same class at UCLA with Zaller, but basically his general thought is that he likes the two-party system and that he thinks that the parties are coalitions of organized political factions. So you have like the Democratic Party has like a union element of it and a pro-choice element, and like a different like sort of groups that each get a little, like they're each holding a string to pull at the one in the center. And these sort of coalitions are always like doing these behind the scenes kind of deals, but they also end up representing through these organized groups kind of getting what the constituents would want, sort of. It's like super messy, but also that it works. And so anyway, I'm not taking a firm position on that, but I just thought just to add the other perspective, because you and he were agreeing, so I wanted to give a voice to the other side of that.
Yeah. So may I make one other comment too?
Oh, absolutely. Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that kind of comes down to, and this is why I don't want it to fall onto, me supporting one political party over the other, because you could look at the most the most obvious example of somebody like, all in the Democratic Party, somebody like Hillary Clinton versus somebody like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, where I'm not saying that I necessarily believe that Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders would be a great president, but that based on the way they ran their campaign finance, based on the way at least Bernie Sanders has voted historically, what he stands for.
Yeah.
His constituents in Vermont are going to vote because they believe that he's going to do these things. When you look at somebody like Hillary Clinton, you're not sure who they're beholden to. So are they representing a faction of the Democratic Party, or are they representing the lobby that funded their campaign the most during that particular session? So the idea is, whether you believe in conservative values, liberal values, or somewhere in the middle, we should be electing legislators with transparency so that we know that they're going to do what they say when they're in office. And we should have an education system that allows us to understand what is fact, what's fiction, and how these legislators are carrying these out. And those two together is basically what I'm kind of getting at, is how we create a more perfect government.
Excellent. Well, in everything, the research you did just generally in your life or leading up to this or whatever, is there anything that you got a lot from that you would maybe want to give a reference to? I can put in the show notes, like a good book, a good TV program, documentary, whatever, like website.
I would say, there's been, as far as, quotes and support for the article in this conversation, a lot of it came from NPR, a lot from Washington Post. If I were to say from a more philosophical or background argument, I would recommend everybody read Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. That kind of details a lot more of the historical aspect and a lot more of the root behind this ideology. I think whatever your political agenda or perspective is, it's a book that anybody could definitely learn and definitely could learn from.
Right on. Okay, I'll make sure that link's in the show notes. So any other larger takeaways just from the whole conversation that you think to tie all these things up that really stuck with you?
Last thing that I would say is, yeah, I guess, I think it probably has become apparent that, my political views are on average a little bit more left leaning, but just like I think the mentality of anybody in the Change My View community, my favorite conversations, the conversations I'm most interested in having, are those with as polar opposite views of myself. And I would just implore anybody listening to to always resist echo chambers, whatever side of the spectrum that you're on. Always, try to engage in, educated, respectful, and balanced conversation and debate. Keep learning and, keep trying to work to affect change.
Awesome. Well, just from going through this post and everything, you gave out 3 deltas. You were fully engaged all the way through. You weren't just answering the top comments. You were right in there with everyone. So for anyone who's listening who wants to see what a textbook example of a great OP is, check out this post. The link will be in the show notes. So thank you for coming on, and also for your post that that brought up so much great discussion within the subreddit, and really added hugely to the fabric of what the subreddit's all about and what we do. So that's always invaluable, and I think it does a good in the world. So thank you for doing your part, man. That's great.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
Right on. Well, thanks for coming, and then hang on the line with me. I'm just going to end the recording now, and yeah, thanks for listening, everyone, and adios.